Thanks for coming. I'm hopefully going to provide some entertainment in this talk. Certainly the goal that I have is to perhaps introduce just some different ways of thinking about some topics that I think you all are pretty familiar with. The other thing that I was going to say is that I have slides that I'm going to sort of talk to, but I'm hoping to have, there certainly will be questions after. There might be a bunch of questions I might ask you all during the talk. So here's the sort of the bottom line, sort of up front, to sort of give you a sense about what you're in for. The first thing that I want to get across is that there is a shift. There's something in the air, in the sort of the zeitgeist of the tech industry, towards understanding incidents in sort of deeper ways. I'd say that there's maybe a nascent, but I'd say accelerating community of people who are looking to borrow techniques and methods and approaches from other domains and apply it here in software. So I'll talk a little bit about that. The reason for this sort of growth is of sort of interest, curiosity, enthusiasm, is because incidents can yield much more value than has been sort of recognized thus far. And this is the conventional, typical sort of techniques of learning from failure, learning from incidents and postmortems and all of that. It can go much further, and we're kind of leaving a whole bunch of valuable sort of things on the table. And a lot of this sits firmly on this idea that learning is different than fixing. And it's quite often you hear a lot of cliches of, we never want to, let a good crisis go to waste. Or, of course, we want to learn from failure and take, all the lessons we can from our mistakes. But quite often what happens is we'll say that, and we'll say learning, but learning is a pretty complex cognitive phenomena. There's perception, and then there's memory. And so usually what we really mean, typically, conventionally, is not really learning, is more like fixing. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to sort of end this idea that saying that doing this really well takes some time. I've been sort of studying this. I'm a recovering CTO. I used to work at a company called Etsy, which is across the river. And much of doing sort of incident analysis involves maybe looking at doing some things that you're not used to, especially software engineers, taking some perspectives that we're not used to in the industry. And it takes practice and coaching and all that sort of thing. I will sort of talk about some of the pretty straightforward things that you can do to sort of help build on that. But it will prove when you do this really well, and I've seen it, and a small number of organizations who are taking this approach and putting this effort in turns out to be a much more valuable than just it never happened again, or we're having fewer incidents and all that sort of thing. So that's basically the map of the talk here. I am a bit excited because at Spotify, and when I was working at Etsy, I became interested in some of these other domains that I'll talk about, and I managed to find a master's program that I could do while still living in Brooklyn, and it was in Sweden, and I'm hoping to score major bonus points with you all. Now, I understand, so Lund is in southern Sweden, which I understand is not really Sweden compared sort of for people up in Stockholm. I've been told that it's sort of like the Nevada or the Denmark of Sweden. So let's get back to this. So there's a shift taking place. And if you have trouble sleeping, this is the title of my master's thesis. So there's this shift that I'm talking about. This sort of a growing, sort of fast-growing interest and enthusiasm for fields such as human factors, cognitive systems engineering, safety science, resilience engineering, And these fields are sort of intertwined themselves in some varied ways and sort of emerged, not except for human factors, emerged largely in the last 20 or 30 years. But there's a lot of interest in software engineers on this, and that's a lot of where this interest in sort of broader and deeper incident analysis comes from. So how do you know that there is this, how can I tell that people are paying attention to this? Well, we're in software engineering, which means that we can't shut up about what we're enthusiastic about. And so what you'll find are lots of conference talks on sort of various topics, even in Australia. I will have to say that I'm lucky enough to have convinced ACM to do a special issue on the critical role of human performance in software. And this is, I think ACMQ is free on the web, and there's a collection of 5 different articles that place this with scientific rigor, this study of what makes human performance difficult and what we are doing that actually every day that prevents incidents from happening, because you are. You know, it's definitely real when there's an entire conference centered around these topics. The Redeploy conference, it's been 2 years now. I think they're going to do it again. I mentioned Lund in the program that I was in. There's not only just graduates, but there are multiple people from software, from multiple different organizations that are also enrolled. And so you know that this is a serious thing when somebody makes the commitment. You know, if, you know, bananas, you know, John Allspaw goes off, that's just a one-off, right? But when there are more people in the industry interested in making this commitment, you know that it's sort of real. I will have to say that this reminds me very much. There was a world when continuous deployment and delivery and DevOps and even sort of concepts from distributed systems was not a thing in the industry. And it slowly became a thing, and the sort of the emergence of, for example, I don't know if people are aware of the meetups, Papers We Love, and conferences talking about these concepts that were never, they had been called too academic, or certainly takes a lot more effort to, because you have to read more than code to understand them. And then finally, I would say that there's a website, learningfromincidents.io. Nora Jones, who's in the Lund program, is graciously and eloquently started sort of a community. It's a cross-company interest group. I will say that what you will find, you see Nora Jones and Casey Rosenthal. These are two names that have been in the past associated primarily with chaos engineering. There's a significant overlap, and in fact, actually, this sort of simplistic sort of Venn diagram doesn't really capture it. I'm not going to talk about that. I certainly can sort of after the talk. But there are some important parallels and contrasts there. So the shift in perspective. Hold on one second. I'm going to get water. Okay. So this notion that we can spend some time, fill out a form, or that all incidents have a similar structure that can fit into sort of boxes, and we can sort of capture that is sort of, I'm going to sort of put out as sort of a typical or conventional approach, practice. These generally end up in either documents that don't capture very much about what it's like to be in an incident or handle an incident or predict or anticipate or respond to an incident. It tends to sort of collapse as much as possible into sort of objective and largely numerical. here's when it started, here's how long it lasted, and here's the average of the last, of how long they lasted, these last incidents, and here's some severity, and here's some, and if you can put that into numbers, then it makes it great for spreadsheets, and you can make charts of it, and it gives you some sort of comfort or sense that you have control over the future. As a result, it also turns into, in an effort to become efficient, largely focused on fixing. And I want to make a contrast there between a different sort of this broader, deeper sort of route, which is really an effort to capture really the messy reality of incidents, because they don't go from detection to diagnosis to resolution in these nice little neat sort of buckets with these boundaries that are straightforward and unambiguous. They tend also to gather multiple perspective views, because almost always teams of people are the ones responding to, and also making attempts to anticipate and doing projects that have presumably preventative designs in them, informed by their experience in the past. As a result, if and when you can do this, you can end up with these sort of much more rich and compelling stories. These are documents that people want to read. People are looking forward to read. And because people can read, the idea that somebody can become familiar with or learn something from an incident that they didn't respond to an event that was discussed, that they didn't even attend, some sort of post-incident group meeting for, it means that you can get things out of engineers like, oh, I didn't know it worked that way. Or, wait a minute, I thought it worked like this. I wonder what will happen if this or that. And spurring new dialogue is important. As a result, if you focus on fixing, that's one thing. If you focus on learning, better informed fixing can come from that. That's the gist of what I'm trying to go for here. Give me a roll of duct tape, and I can fix anything. So, what's the result? Why would you do this? Well, one, it means that you could think of, I want you to imagine, a write-up of an analysis that could be used as, and sort of even acknowledged as, a rich source of confidence for engineers. If you think about all the tests we write and all of the dark launches and the feature flags and the config flags and A/B testing and chaos experiments, all of that is about generating and or possibly amplifying confidence that the code is going to do what you expect it to do under the conditions you can imagine that it can do. What incidents are effective, extremely effective directors of attention. Incidents are like these sort of, if you sort of personify an incident, if you think of it as an incident saying, hey everybody, come, I think you should come look right around here, because I'm pretty sure it doesn't work the way you think it does. And in that way, it directs your attention in a particular way. And then that way, you can get a better sense. They're sort of showing you that blind spots are there. As a result, you can have better informed project roadmaps. You can imagine a world where you would say to a group of staff engineers, all right, look, I think this thing we should replace this piece of the stack here. So can you come up with some general ideas? We're not going to build anything, just some options, do some sort of design, like a whiteboard or whatever. And then let's talk about it after you all come up with one or two options. Okay. Oh, and by the way, you are prohibited from including and taking into account any experience you've ever had with incidents with the stack. Sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, right? Whether we know that they affect our plans for the future, they definitely do. We find that knowledge islands, that is to say, especially in fast-growing companies, engineers may have esoteric, really sort of almost sort of specialized knowledge about this thing that everybody knows they know. But it's not like you could go on the wiki and say, what does Lisa know? And just look up what Lisa knows. The reason why you can't do that is actually Lisa also might not know that what she knows will be of important sort of consequence in the future. But what incidents can do is show you what people do know, because everything's time compressed and consequential. And everybody knows to call Sylvia. When this thing happens, that's the run book. The run book is call Sylvia, because when she shows up, shit gets done. And it's just straightforward. It's kind of sort of, magic. This is what does happen. You understand about different teams depending on each other's, their services, their tooling. You can use incidents as training materials for new engineers. For leaders who want to understand, are we still using this service? Should I cancel this contract? I don't know. Should we look at an alternative? The details, these messy details, can help inform those. There's a great deal of skill, expertise that you all have as hands-on engineers that you might not know that you have. This has been proven over and over in cognitive research. Experts are not necessarily expert at describing what makes them an expert. This tacit knowledge is a significant fuel for what keeps all of your systems working most, if not all of the time. So why is this shift? That last bullet was about legacy, which is, does Spotify, I can't imagine, I've met some companies that have legacy systems that I can imagine. Spotify's probably totally different. The fact is that there's no boundary. Like on April 13th, something doesn't go from not legacy to legacy, right? When something becomes declared legacy, the size of what the boundary is, what is labeled legacy, is pretty subjective. The question is, what views from which vantage points are they assessed? Deep rel analysis can do that. Okay, so against sort of this contrast, right? This is an assertion. These are probably, they might be controversial. Current and typical approaches to learning from business have very little to do with actual learning. And the reason why I feel strongly about this is in most of the organizations that I've seen, including ones that I have run myself and led myself, is that most post-incident review documents are written to be filed, not written to be read. Presumably, there are parts of Spotify that write post-incident documents. Is this fair, right? Great, awesome, amazing. Step one. How many people read them? You read them. How would I know that you read it? I mean, if you think about it, I mean, counting the number of accesses on a web page, I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure that this can be done. And it's pretty simple, but you would think, well, but why are you writing it down if people aren't reading it? And if people who do read it have a full understanding of the incident, if they weren't there, then I would argue, then who's learning? The one I do want to put a bit of a point here, and I have some sort of credibility on this front, in that the notion of blameless retrospective and the sort of concerns, and they're very important, very critical concerns around psychological safety, allowing and supporting engineers to give an account of what was going on for them during the incident, before the incident, after the incident, all that sort of stuff. Critically important, and also is only a required condition. You can be an absolute poster company of psychological safety and learn very little. It's a necessary but not sufficient. Blamelessness doesn't magically make you learn. It sets up the conditions where learning can take place. It rides on top of that. So there's this difference, and a lot of lot of what has led the tech industry to take the approaches that we have been is a bit sort of messy. It's sort of all over the place. We've got some methods over here we'll steal some stuff from Toyota, and I saw this thing on a NTSB report, and blah, 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 sort of cobbled together. In the end, how we imagine incidents happen is what fuels how we believe we should capture how the incident sort of took place. But there's a difference, there's a gap between how we imagine incidents happen and then how incidents actually happen. And there's a significant reason for that, and the biggest barrier probably that underpins almost all of it is hindsight. This notion that you have this tendency to simplify a complex event, right, down to a single, or certainly in some cases sort of a linear story like dominoes or whatever, a singular, here is the story, the timeline constructed. That is this tendency, and largely there's a number of different reasons. I can certainly go on and on about it, but suffice to say that an uncomfortability about this surprise. All incidents are surprises, and a surprise is a contrast to our expectations. And if our expectations don't play out the way we expect we are, then we can be fearful that those expectations will be breached in the future. Our desire for comfort about control, about being able to predict the future, is what brings hindsight. Some have said, with some pretty convincing evidence, that hindsight and what's known as the hindsight bias, it was once called the "I knew it all along" effect, is one of the most studied, closely studied, intensely studied psychological phenomena in modern cognitive psychology. The result of this is that multiple contrasting perspectives can get sort of wiped away in favor of this one sort of line, right? This perceived need to be efficient and crisp in the story is, if I were to use a compression, audio, video, is lossy, right? Smoothing out this messiness is like throwing away valuable data. So and let me give you an example. So I'll give you a true and accurate statement. A high school senior in Illinois led classmates on an 11-hour crime spree, committing fraud, grand theft auto, and cyber crimes. This is a description that is absolutely accurate. There's not one part that's wrong. And I've described Ferris Buellers Day Off, the movie. If you've ever seen it, this is true. This statement, a high school senior in Illinois, raise your hand if you've seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Okay, Colette, it's better than I thought. Right? Now, of course, if you've seen it and you remember the movie, that you can imagine this is a very true story, almost certainly from the perspective of Principal Rooney, right? This is an explanation, a description of an event. Now, if we were to look at how others, here's another representation of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You could make an argument this is really just more of a detailed timeline. It certainly has more data to it, but I can tell you it has a lot more, it's significantly more data, magnitude-wise, than that last statement I gave, and yet still contains that. Now, of course, you wouldn't even say that was really sufficient, because as far as I can tell, I can't get really any understanding of, Cameron's experience, and Cameron had some pretty tough experiences on that day. So this notion that what hindsight does is that before and during an incident, there are conditions that are set up. There are actions that are taking place in parallel at the same time, all of which are contributing to a particular situation. After an incident, it can be easy, like this dude with the magnifying glass, to see a portion. And look how clear it is. I'm going to give you I'm going to try something here. So I want you to pay attention to the screens. So I'm going to give you 10 seconds. And I want to ask you to count the number of F's, the uppercase and lowercase, okay, that appear in the following sentence. Okay. So now I want you to raise your hand if you believe there are 4 Fs. Raise your hand if there are 5 Fs. Raise your hand if there are 6 Fs. Raise your hand if you think there are 7 Fs. Raise your hand if you didn't raise your hand to any of those answers. Yeah. So there are 6 Fs. Now, I walked into this room thinking, now here are some people who have some pretty expert experience with the letter F. And I thought to myself, there's no way that they could possibly fail this. There's no way that they could get this wrong. And by the way, everyone gets this wrong. Otherwise, I wouldn't make it wouldn't be funny and interesting as a slide. The fact of the matter is that in most Western languages, we do not read letter by letter. We read by shapes of words and a whole bunch of other sort of portions of how words look when they're next to each other. Now imagine a world where I've given you this test, which, as far as I can tell, was ridiculously simple, which many of you did not get correct. Okay, if I get to write the story, I could say that there was a lack of rigor, right? That you weren't paying enough attention. Software engineers, you work in text all day. How could you possibly not know this? This was not a failure of procedure. Despite clear and obvious instructions, they were as clear as they could possibly be, and you all ended up being negligent. And I can say this, right? And so what I would say as a recommendation is we would retrain you, right, on what the letter F. So no, but now all of these statements, all of these sort of summarize, this is a summary of your experience written by somebody who didn't undergo the experience, okay? If I change some conditions, if I gave you 60 seconds, the results would be different. If I printed it all out and gave it to you and gave you 10 seconds, the results would be different. The fact is that you're at a internal conference, and I've got this white background, and you can already see if I colored Fs differently, you would have gotten it, that there were 6 there. So the point that I want to get at is who gets to tell a story is significantly important as to what the fixes are, as to what the description, and as how you remember the story in the future, and how you'll tell your colleagues about this particular thing to do. If I leave us with this, I'm not capturing a significant portion of what that experience is like. So now, here's what can be done. You're like, I got it, John. We're terrible. I understand. The industry's awful. So here's this sort of conventional. Actually, first I want to ask, first, is there anybody, raise your hand if you're on call right now. Okay, if you have to just jump up and leave, I'm totally cool, I understand. I have been there, sort of don't worry. All right, now I've got two questions here. I want you to raise your hand if you've ever responded, if you remember responding to an incident and remembering experiencing such a profound sense of confusion about what you were seeing that you just simply had no plausible explanation. Like, I have 0 ideas what's happening right now. Yeah. That's happened to me too. I want you to raise your hand also if you've been responding to an incident and you and your colleagues work out, okay, we might know what's happening, we might not know what's happening, but we think we're all agreed we should do this thing. Like, we should take this action, we should run this command, or hit this button, or do this thing, right? I want you to think back to right when you're about to do this, right? The idea is that it's either going to fix it or prevent it from getting worse or whatever. I want you to zoom back in your memory and try to think, is there ever a situation where you remember right before you're about to do it, thinking, there's a 50% chance this will make everything worse? Okay? Okay. What you all have told me, and the reason why everybody's laughing is because it's so familiar. By the way, I've tried to give this sort of examples to a room full of air traffic controllers, and they don't laugh. But the reason why it's funny, the reason why it's so familiar is because it's palpable. It's in your gut. This is a part of your experience. And guess what? That experience is the stuff that makes stories people will read. We'll come back to this. This conventional view of where post-incident analysis have value is a little bit like this. There's an incident, there's maybe somebody might do some amount of prep, maybe not. They might have a big meeting. Sometimes they call it a post-mortem meeting or a post-incident meeting. It doesn't really matter. And then there may or not be a report, but the tendency is to think that the most important thing is to get the action items. Because if you don't do it, then we must not have learned. But it turns out that this is an extremely expensive meeting. And when this goes really poorly, you've thrown a lot of money out the window. Can you raise your hand if you've ever heard of this parable of the blind man and the elephant? Okay, I'll briefly sort of recap it. But the way the story goes, the way I tell it anyway, is that there's this monarch, there's this king, and who just is fascinated by the world outside the palace, but is totally afraid of it and doesn't want to go. So he goes to his trusted advisors, who are these blind men, these sort of monks, and he said, "Listen, I've heard about this thing, the elephant. I've heard some various bits here and there. I want you, is it real? Is an elephant real? I've never seen one. I'm just kind of fascinated. You go out in the world, find an elephant. I want you to come back and tell me all about it, because I'm bananas. I need to know about it." So they go out and they find an elephant, and they come back. And he says, "Well, did you find an elephant?" And he said, "Oh, yes, Your Highness, we found an elephant." And he said, "Well, what is it? What is it like?" And the first monk says, well, I'll tell you, Your Highness. An elephant is like a really flexible hose. And it moves around, and it's a bit rough or whatever." And another monk says, "No, actually, an elephant's a huge cylinder. In fact, there's a couple of cylinders that go straight to the ground." And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." Now the monk says, "It's like a big wall. It's like a sort of a slightly bumpy, rough, but it's very sort of hard wall." And then the other one says it's really flappy, and there's like a little sort of. So they're all describing. Now all of their perspectives are true and accurate. They're not, and they're valid, most importantly. They're not wrong, they're just not sufficiently having their stories put together. And if you can do that, for example, I can't see the front of this lectern, but you all can. It would be ridiculous for me to describe, or foolhardy, I'm being dramatic, I'm going to calm myself down. It would be sort of foolhardy for me to try to describe the front of the lectern without talking with you all. What we find when you can do this are something, sort of dialogues that look a little bit like this. When you have somebody who has a picture, a mental model of how things work, setting up the conditions for somebody to contrast their mental model with how it works with somebody else's, and more than one person, possibly somebody who has more context of not just how it works, but also the origins of how it became to be the thing that they now know. And now you've worked out this contrast. You've got this opportunity for people to understand, I don't know about this part. I didn't know it worked that way, the number one thing that we would hear. So as a result, you would see, when you can do this and capture this really well, this person captured it as well as could be, except now my reaction to an incident is, "Oh boy, I can't wait to read the write-up." You set this expectation that a write-up will tell you some stuff that you otherwise wouldn't be able to get. My friend Lauren Huckstein at Netflix points this out. So what is an alternative? Well, briefly, I don't have too much time, but briefly, if you spend some effort and time to do an initial analysis, there's lots of data about an event and what surrounds an event prior to this really expensive group meeting. You can, including one-on-one interviews, gathering what people's perspectives are, what was difficult for them, what was surprising for them, what made it surprising, what made it difficult, what still remains a mystery to them about how something broke, or even more upsetting for software engineers, they might be confused about how it got fixed, which can be sometimes more unnerving. Then, in that world, this group meeting is effectively an opportunity for sort of present a collated picture from these multiple perspectives, right? And as presented within context of each other, placed into a context. Here's a slightly controversial, and don't use that meeting to develop ideas about what to do about it, and separate that in time. Have you ever been really stuck on a bug, and the idea of how to fix it comes to you when you're in the shower or when you're at the gym? Soak time is extremely important, especially when working through and grappling with complex events. All the while, you're constructing a narrative. And this narrative has more than just action items. Like I said, there are some opportunities that you can use that it has much more to give. And we've seen this go incredibly well. So I'd say this, interesting incident analysis documents get read, compelling incident analysis documents get read and shared with others, but fascinating ones get read, get shared with others, commented on, asked about, referenced in code comments, in pull requests, in architecture diagrams, in other incident write-ups, in new hire onboarding. And I can tell you this for guarantee, uninteresting documents don't any of it, okay? It's quite often what we think is the problem must be with the sharing. Well, but how do I get people to read it? Well, don't have it be terrible. You can have a method of distribution, but if the content is terrible, then they won't come, right? Right? Green Lantern was a movie that was shown in thousands of theaters. People didn't go because it's terrible. So make effort to highlight these messy details. What was difficult, surprising? How do people understand the origins? What mysteries still remain? Without this, it doesn't provide the backdrop for the incident. It's sort of a skeletal, it's just that one-sentence story of Ferris Buellers Day Off. Here's an example. He just needed a little space. What is that? It's a joke, but that's the punchline, right? It's funny if you have the joke. Did you hear about the claustrophobic astronaut? That's the punchline. The punchline isn't funny. It's only funny with the setup, right? So how could you do this? How could you? Let's say you're trying to find there's a 2-hour outage, and I've got a Slack transcript, sort of longer than, this stage, or a recording that I have to sort of go through. What are signals that lead me to think that might be worthwhile to dig into? What questions should I ask somebody if I'm prepping, if I'm doing sort of an interview? Well, indications that people are surprised, novelty. By the way, these are real things that people have said in chat. Right? It sounds straightforward, but these are people. Here's the thing we know about incidents. People only type things that they believe are important for them to type at the time, and they do not type things that they do not believe are important at the time. So when Steve says, I have no idea what's going on, and Lori says, well, that's terrifying, that's about as good as an invitation of go talk to Lori and Steve as you're going to get. Understanding how people get confused can also be pretty straightforward. You just have to be able to take the stance that you're analyzing an incident. You're both in the details, but you're also looking for the most, the ripest areas to sort of to dig into. So I'm going to leave you with some sort of things to experiment with. Just, like I said, I don't work here, so feel free to dismiss any of them. Try this. Try separating the generation of follow-up items or action items or remediation items from a group incident review meeting. The goal of the review, you'd then say, well, what's the whole goal of the meeting then? The goal of the meeting is to generate new data, to generate this contrast between different people. You're effectively getting all of the blind men in the room before they go talk to the king and placing their stories together, describing to each other what they think happened. Record in the document that you're going to sort of save who responded to the incident and who attended the group meeting. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You should be able to get those. If you do that, now a reader 6 months down the road will have some understanding of who to talk to and what questions they might ask. So capturing things that were done after, and sometimes an incident will happen, and engineers will be like, okay, that's totally over. All right, before I go get a drink, I'm gonna do these things because I can't, there's some things that simply can't wait. We're not gonna wait for a postmortem, I'm just gonna do these things. And everybody's like, yes, please do those things. Capture those. It's quite easy to forget that those are things, but those are literally the most important action items because people couldn't wait. Sometimes there might not be a ticket or sort of evidence that it even happened. Give your write-ups to a brand new engineer and ask them to record any and all questions they've got after reading it. Do you have any questions? I want you to read this. I want you to tell me what you think happened in this incident. And if their questions are really rudimentary, like, what's DB super duper? Because that says there's DB super. Oh, everybody knows what DB super duper is, well, but they don't. And then use that to flesh out. Link this sort of company-specific jargon to the documents that describe them. You want to make things easy for your reader. Ask more people to draw diagrams. Quite often, I'm one of those engineers who will see a wall of text and be like, oh, all right, I have to read this. Or I have to do some work to figure out what's in here that's interesting to me. Having some sort of visual representations is important. Bit more controversial is have someone who was not involved in the event lead the analysis. There's a great blog post on the Learning from Incidents software by Ryan Kitchens, and I would suggest that you go to it. And he says it this way, which is, if the incident analyst participated in the incident, they will inevitably have a deeper understanding and bias towards the incident that will be impossible to remove in the process of analysis. People who are involved will not ask questions that they believe everyone knows. You're not analyzing the incident just for the people who were there. Flip it, reverse it. You're analyzing the incidents for people who weren't there. Resist focusing on reducing the number of incidents. This may or may not be for sort of managers, but I'll again say what Ryan has said. The cliche idea that we would do this work to reduce the number of incidents or to lessen the time to remediate is too simplistic. Of course, organizations want to have fewer incidents. However, stating this as an end goal actually hurts our organizations. Indeed, it will lead to a reduction in incident count, not from actually reducing the number of incidents, but rather lessening how and how often they are reported. What constitutes an incident is much more negotiable and fuzzy than many of us would like to admit. As a result, maybe we don't have to call this an incident, and it won't show up on a graph that goes to the king in the world or queen in the world. Instead, if you were to flip that around and focus on increasing the number of people who want to read reports and attend post-incident review meetings, then you're going to be in some much, much better shape. Because what they learn there will influence all of the things that they do that goes into not having incidents to begin with. Okay? if that makes sense. So that's all I have for slides.